Eleanor Thompson's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel, her Honda Civic slowing to a crawl as something impossible unfolded on Highway 290. Two young bobcats lay motionless on the scorching asphalt, one protectively draped across the other's still form. The healthy one wasn't running. Instead, the tawny creature stood guard like a sentinel, yellow eyes blazing with fierce determination as an 18-wheeler thundered past, missing them by mere feet. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the smaller bobcat gently nudge its companion's face with its nose, a soft, chirping sound cutting through the Texas morning air. "Sweet Lord," she whispered, fumbling for her phone with trembling fingers. This wasn't natural behavior. Bobcats were solitary creatures. Everyone knew that. Yet here was one refusing to abandon what appeared to be its sibling, even as death roared past at 70 miles per hour. Eleanor's mind flashed to her son Billy, 10 years buried, who died trying to save injured wildlife on this very stretch of road. What force could inspire such loyalty? And why did watching it feel like witnessing a miracle she'd waited her entire life to see? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Eleanor May Thompson had driven this same stretch of Highway 290 every Sunday morning for 12 years, ever since Billy's funeral. At 72, her routine was as fixed as the sunrise. Church at 9, grocery shopping at 10:30, home by noon to watch her stories on television. The 1998 Honda Civic knew the route by heart, its odometer clicking past 180,000 miles of faithful service on her teacher's pension of $1,247 a month. But today felt different. Maybe it was the oppressive August heat already shimmering off the asphalt at 7 in the morning, or the persistent drought that had pushed wildlife closer to the roads in search of water. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her around the next bend. She'd taught 3rd grade at Cedar Creek Elementary for 41 years, watching 3 generations of children grow up in this small Texas hill country community. Every child who'd passed through her classroom knew Miss Thompson's rules. Always help those who can't help themselves and never turn your back on family. She'd lived by those words, especially after raising Billy alone when his daddy ran off to Oklahoma with a younger woman. Billy had been her pride and joy, a gentle giant at 6'3" who couldn't bear to see any creature suffer. Even as a little boy, he'd brought home wounded birds, stray cats, and once, memorably, a baby armadillo he'd found by the creek. After high school, he'd studied wildlife rehabilitation at Texas State, dreaming of opening his own sanctuary. "Animals don't judge you, Mama," he'd told her. "They just need someone to care." 10 years ago this September, Billy had been driving this same highway when he'd stopped to help an injured deer. A drunk driver had hit him while he knelt beside the animal, killing them both instantly. Eleanor had never quite recovered from the irony. Her son, who'd spent his life saving creatures, dying while trying to save one more. Now she lived alone in the same 3-bedroom house where she'd raised Billy, surrounded by his photographs and the mounted certificates from his wildlife rescue work. Social Security barely covered her expenses, and her arthritis made the simplest tasks painful, but she persevered. "The good Lord has a plan," she'd tell herself on the hardest days, though lately she'd begun to wonder what that plan might be. The Honda's air conditioning wheezed against the Texas heat as Eleanor crested the hill near mile marker 247. This was where Billy had died, where a small white cross marked the spot where her world had changed forever. She always slowed here, always whispered a prayer, always fought back the tears that threatened to blur her vision. But this morning, something else caught her attention first. 2 small forms on the asphalt ahead, one lying perfectly still while the other moved in frantic circles around it. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as recognition dawned. Bobcats, babies, from the look of them, and one was protecting the other with a devotion that made her heart break all over again. Eleanor pulled her Honda onto the gravel shoulder, hazard lights blinking as her heart hammered against her ribs. Through the dusty windshield, she could see the scene more clearly now. Two young bobcats, probably siblings, with one lying motionless while the other refused to leave its side. The healthy one was a female, Eleanor realized, noting the smaller frame and delicate features. She was beautiful, with thick tawny fur marked by distinctive black spots and tufted ears that swiveled at every sound. But it was the devotion that took Eleanor's breath away. The female bobcat had positioned herself between her injured companion and the road, occasionally draping her body protectively across his still form. When a pickup truck roared past, she pressed herself lower, shielding him from the wind and debris. Her yellow eyes never left his face, and every few minutes she would nudge him gently with her nose, making soft chirping sounds that seemed to say, "Stay with me. Don't leave me alone." Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for her cell phone. She'd lived in rural Texas all her life and knew better than to approach wild animals, especially predators. But she couldn't just drive away. The image of that small, guardian angel refusing to abandon her brother cut straight through to Eleanor's soul, reminding her of every time she'd sat by Billy's hospital bed when he was young, every scraped knee she'd bandaged, every nightmare she'd chased away. 911, what's your emergency? There are two bobcat kittens on Highway 290, about a mile past marker 247, Eleanor said, her voice shaking. One's hurt real bad, maybe hit by a car. The other one won't leave it. I've never seen anything like it. After 2 transfers and a 10-minute wait, Eleanor finally reached Dr. Sarah Collins at Cedar Park Animal Clinic. The veterinarian's voice was crisp and professional, but Eleanor could hear something else underneath, a weariness that spoke of too many losses, too many creatures she couldn't save. "Ma'am, I need you to stay in your vehicle," Dr. Sarah instructed. "Bobcats can be unpredictable, especially when they're protecting family. I'm leaving right now. Can you stay there and make sure no one disturbs them?" "I'm not going anywhere," Eleanor said firmly, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. These babies need someone to watch over them. For 45 minutes, Eleanor sat in her car watching the most remarkable display of devotion she'd ever witnessed. The female bobcat. Eleanor had started thinking of her as Shadow because of how she seemed to merge protectively with her brother, never moved more than a few inches from his side. When a state trooper arrived and tried to approach, Shadow hissed and positioned herself more firmly over her sibling, but she didn't flee. It was as if she understood that help was coming and was willing to trust, but only so far. The injured male, whom Eleanor began calling Storm because of the gray markings on his fur, remained unconscious throughout the wait. His breathing was shallow, and Eleanor could see dark stains on the asphalt beneath him that made her stomach clench. She found herself praying, really praying for the first time in years, that he would survive long enough for help to arrive. When Dr. Sarah's white veterinary van finally appeared on the horizon, Eleanor felt a surge of relief mixed with anxiety. A woman in her late 40s emerged, moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to handling wild animals. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, but Eleanor could see the weight of experience in the set of her shoulders. "I'm Dr. Collins," she said, approaching Eleanor's car first. "You did exactly the right thing by calling and staying." "How long have they been like this?" "Nearly an hour now," Eleanor replied, stepping out of her Honda despite the doctor's earlier warning. "That little girl hasn't left his side once. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and the most heartbreaking." Dr. Sarah studied the bobcats through binoculars, her expression growing more concerned by the minute. "The male has significant injuries, looks like multiple fractures, possible internal bleeding. But what's remarkable is her behavior. Bobcats typically separate from their siblings by this age. This level of bonding is extraordinary." As they watched, Shadow seemed to sense the approaching help. She looked directly at Dr. Sarah with those intense yellow eyes, then at her unconscious brother, then back at the veterinarian. The message was unmistakable. Please, help us. I've been treating wildlife for 15 years, Dr. Sarah murmured, and I've never seen anything like this. It's like she's asking me to save him. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched Shadow gently lick Storm's face, her pink tongue careful around what appeared to be a head wound. That's exactly what she's doing. That little one knows love, Doctor. Real love. The kind that doesn't give up no matter what. The rescue itself was nothing short of miraculous. Doctor? Sarah approached the bobcats with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who understood wild animals, speaking in low, soothing tones. Easy, sweetheart. I'm here to help your brother. Shadow's ears flattened against her head, and she made a low warning sound, but she didn't attack or flee. Instead, she watched Dr. Sarah's every movement with laser-like intensity, as if evaluating whether this human could be trusted with the most precious thing in her world. When the veterinarian knelt beside Storm and gently placed her hands on his still form, Shadow leaned closer, sniffing at the stranger's touch. "Good girl," Dr. Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You can come with him. I promise I won't separate you." The moment Dr. Sarah lifted Storm into her carrier, Shadow followed without hesitation. She settled beside her unconscious brother, curling her body around him in the same protective position she'd maintained on the highway. Eleanor watched through the van's window as Shadow's rough tongue worked gently across Storm's face, cleaning away the blood and dirt with infinite tenderness. "She's trying to heal him," Eleanor said softly, riding in the passenger seat as Dr. Sarah drove toward the clinic. "My Billy used to say animals know things we don't about healing. Said love was the best medicine there was." Dr. Sarah glanced at Eleanor with surprise. "Your son was in wildlife rehabilitation?" "Was going to be," Eleanor replied, her voice catching. "He died 10 years ago in an accident, right back there on 290. He was trying to save an injured deer when a drunk driver hit him." She paused, watching Shadow's devoted ministrations. "Seeing this reminds me so much of Billy. He would have done exactly what she's doing, stayed right there, no matter what." The Cedar Park Animal Clinic was a modest facility, clearly struggling financially but spotlessly clean and well-equipped. Dr. Sarah's veterinary assistant, a young man named Jake, met them at the door. His eyes widened when he saw the bobcats. "Wow, Dr. Collins. I've never seen wild bobcats this calm around humans. Usually they're spitting and clawing." "This isn't usual, Jake," Dr. Sarah replied grimly, carrying the carrier into the examination room. "Nothing about this is usual." The initial examination revealed the extent of Storm's injuries: a fractured pelvis, 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and significant internal bleeding. But it was what Dr. Sarah discovered during the routine scan that changed everything. "Eleanor," she called out, her voice tight with surprise. "You need to see this." Eleanor hurried into the examination room, where Dr. Sarah was staring at a small device she'd removed from Storm's neck, a microchip scanner beeping insistently. "They're both chipped," Dr. Sarah said, her face pale. "Registered to someone named Richard Blackwood in Austin. According to this database, they were purchased 6 months ago as a breeding pair of North American lynx rufus." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "Purchased? You mean someone owns them?" "It gets worse," Dr. Sarah said, her fingers flying over her computer keyboard. "Look at this registration. Blackwood Exotic Acquisitions. He's listed as a licensed exotic animal dealer." She turned the screen toward Eleanor, showing a website filled with photos of caged wild animals. "This is a business, Eleanor. He breeds and sells wild animals to private collectors. Eleanor's legs gave out and she sank into a chair. Those babies escaped, didn't they? They were running from that man, and now... She looked at Shadow, who was pressed against the carrier door, trying to get closer to Storm as he underwent emergency surgery. Now he's going to take them back. Dr. Sarah's jaw was set in a hard line. Not if I can help it. There are laws about animal welfare, about proper care. If I can prove they were mistreated... But the chips, Eleanor said desperately. He has legal proof. He owns them. Microchips can be placed illegally. If these animals were stolen from the wild as babies, or if they were acquired through illegal means... Dr. Sarah pulled up another screen. I'm calling the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. There are regulations about bobcat ownership, breeding permits, facility inspections. Something about this doesn't feel right. As if sensing the tension in the room, Shadow began making a sound Eleanor had never heard before. A low, mournful cry that seemed to communicate pure despair. She was pressed against the exam room door where Storm had been taken for emergency surgery, and her yellow eyes reflected a grief so profound it took Eleanor's breath away. She knows, Eleanor whispered. She knows someone's coming for them. Look at her, Doctor. That's not just animal instinct. That's heartbreak. Dr. Sarah knelt beside the carrier, her professional composure cracking. I've been treating wildlife for 15 years, and I've never seen a bond like this. Even if the ownership is legal, separating them now could kill them both. Shadow's showing signs of severe stress, and Storm... She shook her head. His injuries are touch and go. The trauma of separation could send him into shock. Eleanor made a decision that surprised even herself. How much would it cost to fight this? I mean, if we wanted to challenge the ownership legally? Eleanor, you can't afford... I have Billy's life insurance money, Eleanor interrupted, her voice growing stronger. $25,000 sitting in a savings account because I couldn't bear to spend it. Billy would want me to use it for this. I know he would. Dr. Sarah stared at her. That kind of legal battle could cost everything you have, and we might still lose. Eleanor looked at Shadow, who had now pressed her entire body against the carrier door, her breathing rapid and shallow with distress. In that moment she saw Billy at age 8, cradling an injured sparrow he'd found by the creek, refusing to leave its side even when she'd told him it probably wouldn't survive. Then we'll lose fighting, Eleanor said firmly. But we won't lose without trying. These babies deserve someone willing to stand up for them. Storm's surgery lasted 4 agonizing hours. Eleanor refused to leave the clinic, instead settling into an uncomfortable plastic chair in the waiting room while Shadow paced anxiously in her temporary enclosure nearby. The young bobcat had eaten nothing since their arrival, her yellow eyes fixed on the surgery door as if she could will her brother back to consciousness through sheer determination. She's making herself sick, Jake observed, watching Shadow reject another offering of food. I've never seen anything like it. It's like she's grieving. Eleanor nodded, remembering the weeks after Billy's funeral when she'd barely been able to force down a piece of toast. Grief's the same, whether you've got 4 legs or 2, honey. That little girl's heart is breaking. Dr. Sarah emerged from surgery just after 2 in the afternoon, exhaustion etched in every line of her face. He made it through, she announced, stripping off her bloodied gloves. The internal bleeding is stopped, and I've stabilized the fractures with pins and plates, but he's not out of the woods yet. The next 24 hours will tell us if he's going to pull through. Shadow seemed to understand the moment Storm was wheeled back into the recovery room. She pressed herself against the mesh of her temporary enclosure, making soft, chirping sounds that Eleanor had come to recognize as her way of calling to him. When Dr. Sarah opened the door between their spaces, Shadow immediately curled up beside her unconscious brother, her purr so loud it filled the room. "Look at that," Dr. Sarah whispered, tears in her eyes. She's trying to comfort him, even though he can't hear her. Eleanor wiped her own eyes. Oh, he can hear her, doctor. Love has a voice all its own. Over the next few days, Eleanor found herself spending more time at the clinic than at home. Her Social Security check barely covered the gas money for the daily trips, but she couldn't bear to leave Shadow and Storm alone. She brought homemade chicken soup for Dr. Sarah and Jake, and somehow her presence seemed to calm both the Bobcats and the overworked veterinary staff. It was during these long vigils that Eleanor learned about Dr. Sarah's own heartbreak. The veterinarian had lost her 8-year-old daughter Emma to leukemia 5 years earlier, a loss that had ended her marriage and left her pouring all her maternal energy into saving animals instead of children. Emma wanted to be a veterinarian, Dr. Sarah confided one evening as they watched Shadow groom Storm's healing wounds with infinite patience. She used to say she was going to save all the animals in the world. I opened this clinic in her memory, but some months I can barely keep the lights on. Treating wildlife doesn't exactly pay the bills. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. Billy used to say the same thing about saving animals. Said every creature deserved someone to fight for them. She paused, watching Shadow's gentle ministrations. Maybe that's why these babies came to us. Maybe Emma and Billy sent them. On the third day, Storm finally opened his eyes. His first act was to look for Shadow, making a weak mewing sound that brought her immediately to his side. The reunion was so tender that even Jake had to leave the room to compose himself. I've never seen anything like this bond, Dr. Sarah said, watching Storm rest his head against Shadow's flank. They're not just siblings. They're each other's entire world. But their peaceful recovery was shattered on Thursday morning when Richard Blackwood finally made his appearance. Eleanor was hand-feeding Shadow pieces of chicken when she heard the expensive purr of a luxury car pulling into the clinic's parking lot. Through the window, she watched a tall, impeccably dressed man in his 50s emerge from a black Mercedes, followed by 2 other men in suits. Everything about Richard Blackwood screamed money and power, from his Italian leather shoes to his perfectly styled silver hair. "Dr. Collins," Blackwood announced as he strode into the clinic, not bothering with pleasantries. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Dr. Sarah's face went pale, but she stood her ground. "Mr. Blackwood, I presume, these animals were found injured on a public highway. I'm treating them according to state wildlife rehabilitation protocols." Blackwood's smile was cold and calculated. "These are not wild animals, doctor. They are registered, microchipped exotic pets that escaped from my facility 6 months ago. I have all the documentation proving ownership." He gestured to one of his companions, who produced a briefcase full of official-looking papers. Eleanor felt her heart sink as she looked at the documents. Everything appeared legitimate. Purchase records, veterinary certificates, even photos of Shadow and Storm as tiny kittens in cages. But what made her stomach turn was the clinical way the paperwork described them. Breeding stock, female designated LR47, and male designated LR48. "They're not breeding stock," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with anger. "They're babies with names and feelings and—" "Ma'am," Blackwood interrupted dismissively, "these animals represent a significant financial investment. The female alone is worth $15,000, and the male nearly as much. I've been searching for them for months." Dr. Sarah stepped forward, her professional demeanor barely concealing her fury. "Mr. Blackwood, these animals show signs of severe psychological trauma. Separating them now could be fatal, especially for the male who's still recovering from major surgery." "That's a risk I'm willing to take," Blackwood replied coldly. "They'll receive adequate veterinary care at my facility. I have a 48-hour legal window to reclaim my property, and I intend to exercise that right." Eleanor watched in horror as Shadow seemed to sense the threat. The young bobcat moved protectively in front of Storm, her ears flattened and her body tense. She fixed Blackwood with a stare so intense and accusatory that even he seemed momentarily unsettled. "You see that?" Eleanor said, pointing at Shadow's defensive posture. "She knows. She knows you're the reason they were running. What did you do to them?" Blackwood's facade slipped for just a moment, revealing something cruel beneath the polished exterior. "I provided them with food, shelter, and veterinary care. If they chose to destroy thousands of dollars worth of fencing to escape, that's hardly my fault." "Destroy fencing?" Dr. Sarah repeated. "These are 8-month-old bobcats. How desperate would they have to be to risk injury trying to escape?" "That's irrelevant," Blackwood snapped. "I'll be back tomorrow morning with a sheriff's deputy and a court order. Have them ready for transport." He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and, Doctor, I'd be very careful about harboring stolen property. The penalties can be quite severe." After Blackwood left, the clinic fell into stunned silence. Eleanor sank into a chair, feeling every one of her 72 years weighing on her shoulders. Shadow had retreated to Storm's side, where she now lay pressed against him as if trying to merge their bodies into one unbreakable unit. "We can't let him take them," Eleanor said finally. "Look at them, Sarah. They know what's coming. They're terrified." "Doctor." Sarah was already on the phone with a lawyer friend, but Eleanor could tell from her expression that the news wasn't good. "There might be a legal challenge," she said after hanging up. "If we can prove the animals were acquired illegally, or if we can show that Blackwood's facility doesn't meet state standards for exotic animal care." "How long would that take?" Eleanor asked. "Weeks, maybe months, and it would cost thousands in legal fees with no guarantee of success." Eleanor looked at her savings account balance on her phone. $24,847. Billy's life insurance money sitting untouched because spending it felt like letting go of her son forever. But watching Shadow comfort her injured brother, seeing the pure love and devotion in their bond, Eleanor finally understood what Billy would want her to do. "Use it," she said simply. "Use every penny if you have to." Billy always said every creature deserves someone willing to fight for them. She stood up, her arthritic joints protesting, and walked over to Shadow and Storm's enclosure. "Well, babies, looks like you've got yourselves a fighter." That night, Eleanor stayed at the clinic, unwilling to leave Shadow and Storm alone with the knowledge that tomorrow might bring separation. She dozed fitfully in the waiting room chair, waking every hour to check on them. Each time she found Shadow awake and vigilant, as if she too understood that their time together might be measured in hours rather than days. Around 3 in the morning, Eleanor was startled awake by a soft sound from the recovery room. She hurried over to find Storm standing for the first time since his surgery, his legs shaky but determined. He was nuzzling against Shadow's neck, and she was purring so loudly it seemed to vibrate through the entire clinic. "That's right, sweet boy," Eleanor whispered through the mesh. "You hold on to your sister. Don't you let anyone take you away from each other." As dawn broke over Cedar Creek, Eleanor made a silent promise to Billy's memory and to the 2 bobcats who had somehow found their way into her heart. Whatever it took, whatever it cost, she would not let them be separated. Some bonds were too precious to break, and some loves too pure to sacrifice to greed and legal technicalities. The real fight was just beginning. Blackwood arrived at exactly 9 o'clock Friday morning, accompanied by Sheriff's Deputy Marcus Rodriguez and a transport van that made Eleanor's blood run cold. The vehicle was equipped with individual steel cages, each barely large enough for a single animal to stand and turn around. Through the mesh windows, Eleanor could see other creatures, a red fox cowering in one corner, several exotic birds huddled in cramped carriers, and what appeared to be a young coyote pacing frantically in a space no bigger than a closet. "Dear God," Dr. Sarah whispered, staring at the transport van. "Those conditions are barbaric." Deputy Rodriguez, a man in his 30s with kind eyes and obvious discomfort with his assignment, approached Dr. Sarah apologetically. "Ma'am, I'm sorry about this, but I have a court order for the immediate return of 2 Bobcats to Mr. Blackwood. Says here they're registered under numbers LR47 and LR48. Eleanor felt her heart breaking as she watched Shadow sense the approaching danger. The young Bobcat had positioned herself between Storm and the door, her body language screaming defiance and terror. Storm, still weak from surgery, tried to stand, but his legs gave out. Shadow immediately moved to support him, their bond so evident that even Deputy Rodriguez paused. "Sir," Eleanor said, stepping forward with all the dignity she could muster, "those aren't numbers. They're Shadow and Storm, and they're brother and sister who've never been apart. Look at them. Can't you see how much they love each other?" Deputy Rodriguez glanced at the Bobcats, then at Blackwood's impatient expression, clearly torn between duty and conscience. "Ma'am, I understand your feelings, but the law is the law. Mr. Blackwood has proper documentation of ownership." "Documentation that could be fraudulent, Doctor," Sarah interjected, her voice steady despite the desperation in her eyes. "I've contacted Texas Parks and Wildlife about irregularities in his permits. We just need more time to—" "Time's up, Doctor," Blackwood interrupted coldly. "Deputy Rodriguez, I'd like my property loaded immediately. I have other appointments today." Eleanor watched in horror as Jake wheeled a transport crate toward Shadow and Storm's enclosure. The moment the door opened, Shadow launched herself in front of Storm with a fierce, protective cry that echoed through the clinic. She wasn't just afraid. She was heartbroken, making a sound Eleanor had never heard from any animal, a keening wail that spoke of loss too deep for words. "You can't separate them," Eleanor pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "She's trying to tell you. They'll die without each other." "Sentimental nonsense," Blackwood snapped, though Eleanor noticed he wouldn't look directly at the Bobcats. "Animals adapt. They forget. Within a week, they won't even remember each other." But Shadow's behavior proved him wrong. As Jake approached with thick gloves and a catchpole, she didn't attack or flee. Instead, she looked directly at Eleanor with those piercing yellow eyes and made a sound that was unmistakably a plea. Then she did something that stopped everyone in their tracks. She gently picked up Storm by the scruff of his neck as a mother would carry a kitten and tried to drag him toward the far corner of the enclosure. "She's trying to hide him," Dr. Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "She knows we can't protect them, so she's trying to protect him herself." Deputy Rodriguez lowered his head, clearly struggling with what he was witnessing. "Mr. Blackwood, maybe we could work out some arrangement. The animals are obviously bonded, and separating them seems cruel." "I'm not running a charity, Deputy," Blackwood replied harshly. "These animals will be housed according to industry standards. If the female is distressed, she'll get over it once she's bred. That's what she's for." Eleanor felt something inside her snap. All the grief she'd carried for Billy, all the helplessness she'd felt watching her son die trying to save innocent creatures, crystallized into pure fury. "Billy Thompson was my son," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He died 10 years ago on Highway 290, trying to save an injured deer. He spent his whole life believing that every creature deserved love and protection, and I'll be damned if I'll let you treat these babies like breeding machines." She stepped between Jake and the enclosure, her arthritic hands shaking but her resolve absolute. "You want them? You'll have to go through me first." "Ma'am," Deputy Rodriguez said gently, "I can't let you interfere with a legal order." "Then arrest me," Eleanor said defiantly. "I'm 72 years old, and I've got nothing left to lose except my conscience. If standing up for these babies means going to jail, Then so be it. Blackwood's face darkened with rage. This is ridiculous. Deputy, remove this woman and load my animals immediately. But as Deputy Rodriguez reluctantly moved toward Eleanor, Dr. Sarah's phone rang. She answered it quickly, her expression changing as she listened. Yes, I understand. Thank you. She hung up and faced Blackwood with new confidence. That was Texas Parks and Wildlife. They're issuing an emergency hold on any transport of these animals pending a full investigation into your breeding facility. Blackwood's composure cracked. That's impossible. My permits are in perfect order. Are they? Dr. Sarah asked, pulling up something on her computer. Because, according to state records, your facility was cited 3 times last year for inadequate housing conditions. And there's no record of the required quarterly health inspections for any animals acquired in the past 8 months. Those are minor administrative issues. There's also the matter of the illegal modification to your property boundaries, Dr. Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. It seems you've been operating outside your permitted acreage without proper zoning approval. That invalidates your exotic animal license. Eleanor watched Blackwood's face cycle through emotions: anger, fear, and finally a cold calculation that made her skin crawl. This is a temporary setback, he said finally. I have lawyers who will sort this out within days. Enjoy your small victory, ladies, because it won't last long. As Blackwood and his entourage departed, Eleanor sank into a chair, her legs no longer able to support her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading, leaving her shaky and exhausted. But when she looked at Shadow and Storm, still pressed together in their enclosure, she felt a warmth spreading through her chest that she hadn't experienced since Billy's death. We did it, Dr. Sarah said, collapsing beside her. We actually stopped him. For now, Eleanor replied, watching Shadow gently groom Storm's fur. But he'll be back. Men like that don't give up easily. Deputy Rodriguez lingered after the others left, removing his hat and approaching Eleanor with obvious respect. Ma'am, what you did back there, that took real courage. My grandmother would have done the same thing. He paused, glancing at the bobcats. For what it's worth, I'll be filing a report about the conditions I saw in that transport van. Those animals looked terrified. After he left, the clinic fell into peaceful quiet. Storm was getting stronger by the hour, and Shadow finally allowed herself to eat, though she kept one eye on her brother at all times. Eleanor found herself thinking about Billy's last words to her, spoken just hours before his fatal accident. Mama, sometimes the best thing we can do is just show up when something needs saving. That evening, as Eleanor prepared to drive home, Dr. Sarah stopped her at the door. Eleanor, I need you to know something. Fighting Blackwood is going to get expensive, and there's no guarantee we'll win. Are you sure you want to risk everything? Eleanor looked back at Shadow and Storm, now curled together in peaceful sleep, Storm's head resting on Shadow's flank. For the first time in 10 years, she felt like Billy was truly with her, guiding her toward something that mattered. Sarah, honey, she said with a smile that felt rusty from disuse. Billy always said some things are worth risking everything for. I think we just found one of those things. As she drove home through the Texas twilight, Eleanor's heart felt lighter than it had in years. The fight was far from over, but for tonight, Shadow and Storm were safe, together and loved. Sometimes, she thought, that was enough to build a future on. 3 days of false hope ended with devastating swiftness on Monday morning. Eleanor arrived at the clinic to find Dr. Sarah in tears, holding a stack of legal documents that had been served at dawn. Richard Blackwood's lawyers had worked through the weekend, and they'd found every loophole, every technicality, every avenue to reclaim what he considered his property. The Texas Parks and Wildlife hold has been overturned, Dr. Sarah said, her voice hollow with defeat. Blackwood's team proved that the permit violations were administrative errors that don't invalidate ownership. They've also obtained an emergency court order requiring immediate surrender of the animals, with penalties of $10,000 per day if we refuse to comply. Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet. $10,000? But we can't. I don't have. Eleanor, there's more. Doctor. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned to the next page. They're claiming that our interference has caused emotional distress to Mr. Blackwood and damaged his business reputation. He's suing us for $50,000 in damages. Through the open door to the recovery room, Eleanor could see Shadow and Storm sleeping peacefully together, Storm's injured leg draped across Shadow's back. They had no idea that in just hours they would be separated forever. The innocent trust in their faces made Eleanor's chest feel like it was caving in. "How long do we have?" Eleanor asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Sheriff's deputies will be here at 2 o'clock this afternoon." "That's—" Dr. Sarah checked her watch with shaking hands. "4 hours." Eleanor sank into the plastic waiting room chair that had become her second home over the past week. At 72, she'd survived her husband's abandonment, Billy's death, and countless small heartbreaks that came with a lifetime of caring for others. But this felt different. This felt like watching evil triumph over love, and she didn't know how to fight it anymore. "Maybe we should call the news," Dr. Sarah suggested desperately. "Get public opinion on our side. People need to see what we're dealing with." "Won't matter," Eleanor replied, her voice flat with despair. "He's got money and lawyers. We've got nothing but hearts full of love, and apparently that doesn't count for much in a courtroom." As if sensing the heaviness in the air, Shadow awakened and immediately began pacing restlessly around the enclosure. She kept looking toward the clinic's front door, her ears swiveling at every sound. Storm tried to follow her movements, but his healing injuries made him clumsy, and he stumbled twice before settling back down with visible frustration. "Doctor." Sarah knelt beside the enclosure, her voice breaking as she spoke to the Bobcats. "I'm so sorry, babies. I tried so hard to protect you." "We both did." Eleanor watched Shadow press herself against the mesh where Dr. Sarah's hand rested, as if trying to comfort the human who had saved her brother's life. The gesture was so achingly tender that Eleanor had to turn away to hide her tears. The morning dragged by with excruciating slowness. Jake called in sick. Eleanor suspected he couldn't bear to witness what was coming. Local news crews arrived after someone leaked the story, but their presence only seemed to make things worse. The reporters asked invasive questions about Eleanor's finances and Dr. Sarah's struggling practice, turning their desperate fight into a spectacle. "Mrs. Thompson," one particularly aggressive journalist asked, "don't you think it's irresponsible to spend your life savings on animals when you can barely afford your own medical care?" Eleanor looked at the woman with exhausted eyes. "Honey, my medical care won't matter much if I die knowing I stood by and watched innocence get trampled by greed." At 1:30, Eleanor made the hardest decision of her life. She asked Dr. Sarah for a few minutes alone with Shadow and Storm, then knelt beside their enclosure with tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, babies," she whispered. "I promised I'd protect you, and I failed. Just like I failed to protect Billy." Her voice broke completely. "Maybe your mama and daddy are waiting for you somewhere better than this world. Maybe Billy's there too, and he'll watch over you when I can't anymore." Shadow approached the mesh and gently pressed her nose against Eleanor's fingers, as if she understood that this was goodbye. Storm, still weak but determined, struggled to his feet and joined his sister at the fence. For a moment, the three of them stayed like that, two wild creatures offering comfort to a broken-hearted old woman who had tried to save them from a system that valued profit over compassion. At exactly 2 o'clock, the sheriff's vehicles pulled into the clinic parking lot, followed by Blackwood's transport van with its cramped individual cages. Eleanor could see the cruel satisfaction in Blackwood's eyes as he approached the clinic entrance, victory assured by superior resources and legal manipulation. "Time's up," Dr. Sarah said, her professional composure finally crumbling completely. "I can't watch this. I just can't." But Eleanor forced herself to stay. If Shadow and Storm were going to face this horror, the least she could do was be there with them until the very end. The transport began with mechanical efficiency that made Eleanor's stomach turn. Two of Blackwood's workers, wearing thick leather gloves and carrying catch poles, approached Shadow and Storm's enclosure with the detached professionalism of people who had done this countless times before. Shadow immediately sensed the threat, positioning herself in front of Storm with her ears flattened and her body trembling with terror and rage. "Take the male first," Blackwood instructed coldly. "The female will be easier to handle once he's secured." Eleanor watched in horror as the workers opened the enclosure door. Shadow's response was immediate and heartbreaking. She didn't attack the humans, but instead tried desperately to drag Storm toward the back corner, her teeth gently gripping the scruff of his neck as she attempted to hide him behind the water bowls and blankets that had become their temporary home. "Please," Eleanor begged, stepping forward despite Deputy Rodriguez's restraining hand on her arm. "Can't you see what you're doing to them? She's trying to protect him. She loves him." "Animals don't love, Mrs. Thompson," Blackwood replied dismissively. "They respond to stimuli and conditioning. This is simply territorial behavior that will fade once they're properly housed in separate facilities." But Shadow's anguished cries as the workers cornered Storm proved Blackwood wrong. The sound that tore from her throat wasn't territorial aggression. It was the keening wail of a sister watching her brother being taken away, a sound so primal and devastating that even the hardened transport workers paused in their duties. Storm, weak from surgery but driven by desperation, tried to fight his way back to Shadow. His injured leg gave out, sending him crashing to the floor of the enclosure, but he continued struggling toward his sister with single-minded determination. The sight of his pain only intensified Shadow's distress, her cries becoming so heartbroken that Dr. Sarah fled the room in tears. "Got him," one of the workers announced as he managed to loop the catch pole around Storm's neck. The young Bobcat's eyes went wide with terror as he was dragged away from Shadow, his claws scraping against the floor tiles as he fought to return to the only family he'd ever known. Eleanor felt something break inside her chest as she watched Storm being forced into one of the cramped transport cages. The space was barely large enough for him to stand, with no room to turn around or lie down comfortably. Through the mesh, she could see his yellow eyes searching frantically for Shadow, his mouth open in silent cries that spoke of abandonment and confusion. Shadow's response to her brother's capture was even more devastating. She began throwing herself against the enclosure walls with such force that Eleanor feared she would seriously injure herself. Her cries escalated to screams that seemed to echo from her very soul, a mother's lament for a child being torn away. "Stop it!" Eleanor shouted, her composure finally shattering completely. "You're killing them! Can't you see you're killing them?" Blackwood's face remained impassive, but Eleanor caught a flicker of something, perhaps discomfort, perhaps guilt in his eyes before he looked away. "Load the female," he ordered his workers, "and be quick about it. We have other stops to make today." The capture of Shadow proved even more traumatic. She fought with the desperation of a creature who had already lost everything that mattered, her small body fueled by pure anguish. When the catchpole finally secured her, she didn't struggle against the restraint. Instead, she went completely limp, as if all the fight had drained out of her in an instant. Eleanor watched in horror as Shadow was placed in a separate cage on the opposite side of the transport van from Storm. Through the mesh barriers, the siblings could see each other but couldn't touch, couldn't comfort each other in their terror. Storm pressed his nose against his cage door, making soft, chirping sounds that Shadow answered with increasingly weak mews. "This is torture," Dr. Sarah said, having returned in time to witness the final separation. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm documenting everything for my report to the American Veterinary Medical Association. This treatment violates every principle of animal welfare." "Document whatever you like, Doctor," Blackwood replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. "My lawyers will be very interested in your interference with a legitimate business operation." As the transport van's engine started, Eleanor found herself moving without conscious thought. She ran to the vehicle and pressed her hands against Storm's cage, looking into his terrified yellow eyes through the mesh. "I'm sorry, sweet boy," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. Billy would be ashamed of me." Storm pressed his nose against the mesh where her fingers rested, and for a moment they were connected. A frightened young animal and a heartbroken old woman who had both learned that love wasn't always enough to protect what mattered most. From across the van, Shadow made one last desperate attempt to reach her brother, pushing her paw through the mesh of her cage as far as it would go. Storm stretched toward her with his own paw, but the distance was too great. Their claws touched only empty air. Eleanor stepped back as the van began to pull away, watching through the rear windows as Shadow and Storm continued their futile attempts to reach each other. The image would haunt her dreams for months afterward. Two innocent creatures separated by mere feet that might as well have been continents. Their bond broken by human greed and legal technicalities. Doctor. Sarah put her arm around Eleanor's shoulders as they watched the van disappear down the highway. "I'll keep fighting this," she promised. "There has to be something we can do, some appeal we can file." But Eleanor felt the weight of defeat settling over her like a shroud. "It's over, honey. We lost." She looked at the clinic where, just hours earlier, Shadow and Storm had been sleeping peacefully together, healing from their trauma and learning to trust humans again. Maybe this is just how the world works now. Maybe there's no room left for love to win over money. The local news crews captured Eleanor's breakdown as she stood in the clinic parking lot, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. The footage would later go viral, touching hearts across the country, but in that moment, Eleanor felt nothing but the crushing weight of failure. That evening, alone in her empty house for the first time in a week, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table staring at Billy's photograph. The young man in the picture smiled back at her with the confidence of someone who believed that good always triumphed over evil, that love was stronger than greed, that standing up for the innocent was always worth the cost. "I tried, son," she whispered to the photograph. "I tried so hard to be like you, to fight for them the way you would have. But I wasn't strong enough. I wasn't smart enough. I let them down just like I let you down." The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the old mantel clock that had belonged to Eleanor's mother. For 10 years she had lived with the guilt of Billy's death, wondering if she could have somehow prevented it, somehow saved her son from his own generous heart. Now she carried a new guilt, the knowledge that somewhere in Austin, 2 young bobcats were facing a future of captivity and separation because she hadn't been clever enough or rich enough to protect them. Eleanor pulled out her phone and scrolled through the contacts until she found Dr. Sarah's number. She typed several messages and deleted them all, unsure what words could possibly express the depth of her grief and regret. Finally, she set the phone aside and shuffled to her bedroom, where she lay fully clothed on top of the covers, staring at the ceiling and listening to her heart break all over again. Outside her window, The Texas night was filled with the sounds of wild creatures going about their lives. Coyotes calling in the distance, owls hunting in the darkness, the rustle of small animals in the brush. Eleanor wondered if any of them understood what it meant to lose family, to have love torn away by forces beyond their control. She suspected they did, and the thought only made her feel more alone. Eleanor had been home for less than 2 hours when her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Exhausted and emotionally drained, she almost didn't answer, but something compelled her to pick up on the fourth ring. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Detective Maria Santos with the Austin Police Department. I need to speak with you about Richard Blackwood and the bobcats that were taken from the veterinary clinic today." Eleanor's heart began to race. "Are Shadow and Storm all right? Has something happened to them?" "Ma'am, I need you to come down to the station if you're able. There's been a development in the case that you need to know about. And Mrs. Thompson, you might want to bring Dr. Collins with you." The drive to Austin felt endless. Dr. Sarah had arrived at Eleanor's house within minutes of the phone call, her face pale but determined. Neither woman spoke much during the journey, both afraid to hope after the devastating defeat they'd suffered just hours earlier. The Austin Police Department was a maze of fluorescent-lit corridors and busy officers, but Detective Santos met them at the front desk. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen too much of humanity's darker side. "Thank you both for coming," Detective Santos said, leading them to a small conference room. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear, but it's also going to change everything about your case." Eleanor gripped Dr. Sarah's hand under the table, steeling herself for more bad news. "Are the bobcats hurt?" "No, ma'am. They're safe. In fact, they're being transported back to Dr. Collins' clinic as we speak." Detective Santos opened a thick file folder. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to ask you about your son Billy. Tell me about the accident that killed him." Eleanor felt the familiar stab of pain that always accompanied memories of Billy's death. "He was helping an injured deer on Highway 290. A drunk driver hit him. Why are you asking about Billy?" Detective Santos pulled out a photograph and slid it across the table. It was a police report from 10 years ago, documenting Billy Thompson's fatal accident. "Mrs. Thompson, the driver who killed your son wasn't drunk. The toxicology report came back negative for alcohol and drugs. The accident was ruled a hit and run, but the case was never solved." Eleanor stared at the report, her world tilting. "That's not... They told me he was drunk. The insurance company, the police report I saw." "The report you saw was falsified," Detective Santos said gently. "Someone with considerable influence managed to alter the official records. Mrs. Thompson, the vehicle that killed your son was a black Mercedes registered to Richard Blackwood." The conference room fell into stunned silence. Eleanor felt as if she couldn't breathe, as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. "Doctor." Sarah's hand tightened around hers, anchoring her to reality as the truth crashed over her in waves. "That's impossible," Eleanor whispered. "Why would he?" "Billy was just helping an animal." Detective Santos pulled out another document. "We've been investigating Blackwood's exotic animal operation for months, following a tip from a former employee. What we discovered is a sophisticated illegal trafficking network stretching across 3 states. Your son Billy had been documenting Blackwood's activities, photographing trucks full of stolen wildlife, gathering evidence for a report he planned to submit to federal authorities." Eleanor's vision blurred with tears. "Billy never told me." "He was trying to protect you, Mrs. Thompson. According to his notes, which we found hidden in his apartment, Billy had tracked several instances of Blackwood's people stealing animals from wildlife rehabilitation centers, including the parents of the bobcats you've been caring for." "Doctor." Sarah leaned forward, her voice shaking. "You're saying Shadow and Storm are the children of animals Billy was trying to save?" "More than that," Detective Santos replied. Billy died on his way to deliver evidence that would have shut down Blackwood's operation 10 years ago. The deer he stopped to help had been deliberately placed on the highway as bait. Blackwood was waiting for him. Eleanor felt the world spinning around her. Billy hadn't died because of his compassion. He'd been murdered because of it. Murdered by the same man who had torn Shadow and Storm apart just hours earlier. "How do you know all this?" Dr. Sarah asked. Detective Santos smiled grimly. "Because yesterday, Blackwood made a critical mistake. When his workers loaded Shadow and Storm into that transport van, one of our undercover officers was there with a recording device. We've been building a case against him for months, but we needed him to incriminate himself." She pressed play on a small digital recorder. Blackwood's voice filled the room, clear and damning. "These animals represent loose ends, just like that Thompson boy 10 years ago. Sometimes you have to eliminate problems before they become bigger problems. The old woman and the veterinarian have seen too much. Once we have the Bobcat secured, we'll need to consider permanent solutions." Eleanor's hands began to shake uncontrollably. "He was going to kill us?" The recording device captured over 3 hours of conversation in the transport van. Detective Santos continued. Blackwood confessed to Billy's murder, detailed his illegal trafficking operation, and outlined plans to eliminate anyone who threatened his business. We arrested him 20 minutes after he left Dr. Collins' clinic. Through her shock and grief, Eleanor felt a flame of hope beginning to kindle. "What about Shadow and Storm?" "All animals in Blackwood's possession have been seized as evidence. The Bobcats are being returned to Dr. Collins' clinic, where they'll remain under federal protection until the trial. After that," Detective Santos paused. "Well, given the circumstances and their bond with both of you, I suspect the federal wildlife authorities will be very receptive to a special custody arrangement." Dr. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. "They're really coming back? They're going to be okay?" "More than okay. The federal government is also prepared to offer significant compensation to Mrs. Thompson for the wrongful death of her son, and to Dr. Collins for the emotional distress and financial losses caused by Blackwood's actions." Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the rapid shift from despair to hope. "I don't care about money. I just want to know that Billy's death meant something, that Shadow and Storm will be safe." Detective Santos gathered her papers. "Mrs. Thompson, your son's evidence is what finally brought Blackwood down. His research, his photographs, his documentation of the illegal trafficking, it's all being used to prosecute not just Blackwood, but an entire network of wildlife criminals. Billy's death will save thousands of animals." As they prepared to leave the police station, Detective Santos stopped Eleanor at the door. "Mrs. Thompson, there's one more thing. When we searched Blackwood's property, we found Billy's original evidence files. He'd hidden copies in multiple locations, including a safety deposit box. In his notes, he wrote about 2 baby bobcats whose parents had been killed by Blackwood's people. He called them the survivors, and wrote that someday someone would need to protect them." Eleanor felt Billy's presence so strongly in that moment that she almost turned around, expecting to see him standing behind her. "He knew. Somehow, he knew they'd find their way to me." The drive back to Dr. Sarah's clinic was surreal. Eleanor kept expecting to wake up and find that the entire evening had been a dream, that Shadow and Storm were still trapped in Blackwood's cages, separated and terrified. But when they pulled into the clinic parking lot, she saw the federal wildlife transport van and felt her heart soar with hope. Dr. Sarah unlocked the clinic with trembling hands, and they hurried to the recovery room where 2 federal agents were carefully unloading a single large enclosure. Through the mesh, Eleanor could see Shadow and Storm pressed together, Shadow's protective posture never wavering despite their ordeal. "They refused to be separated during transport," one of the agents explained. Every time we tried to move them to individual carriers, the female became so distressed that we worried about her health. They're bonded in a way I've never seen in wild animals. As soon as the enclosure was secure and the agents had left, Eleanor approached Shadow and Storm with tears streaming down her face. Both bobcats looked up at her approach, their yellow eyes reflecting relief and recognition. Shadow made a soft chirping sound, and Storm struggled to his feet, still favoring his injured leg. "Welcome home, babies," Eleanor whispered, pressing her fingers against the mesh. "You're safe now. You're together, and you're safe." Dr. Sarah knelt beside her, watching as Shadow gently groomed Storm's ears. "They knew," she said softly. "Somehow, they knew we'd bring them back together." Eleanor nodded, thinking of Billy's hidden evidence files, his research into the bobcat's parents, his certainty that someone would need to protect the survivors. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe it was something larger, a pattern of love and protection that stretched across species and generations. "Billy kept his promise," Eleanor said, her voice steady for the first time in hours. "He couldn't save their parents, but he made sure someone would be here to save them." As Shadow and Storm settled into peaceful sleep, curled together in the safety of their enclosure, Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd carried for 10 years. Billy's death hadn't been senseless after all. His courage, his compassion, his willingness to stand up for innocent creatures had rippled forward through time, protecting the very animals he'd died trying to save. Outside the clinic windows, the Texas night was alive with the sounds of wild creatures living free. And inside, 2 young bobcats slept peacefully, their bond unbroken, their future secured by love that had transcended death itself. Eleanor smiled through her tears, feeling Billy's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. Some promises, she realized, take a lifetime to keep, but they're always worth the wait. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in the early morning sunlight outside Dr. Sarah's clinic, watching Shadow chase her 3 healthy kits around the specially built outdoor enclosure that had become their permanent home. The federal government had not only dropped all charges against Eleanor and Dr. Sarah, but had funded the construction of a state-of-the-art wildlife sanctuary on the clinic's expanded property. Storm, now fully recovered except for a slight limp that only added to his dignified bearing, supervised his sister's offspring with the devoted attention of the best uncle in the world. He'd grown protective of the kits, in a way that reminded Eleanor of how Shadow had once protected him, creating an unbroken chain of love and devotion that stretched from one generation to the next. "Hard to believe it's only been half a year," Dr. Sarah said, joining Eleanor with 2 steaming cups of coffee. At 57, the veterinarian looked younger than she had in years, her face bright with purpose and the deep satisfaction that came from meaningful work. The federal compensation and grants had transformed her struggling clinic into a thriving wildlife rehabilitation center that served as a model for facilities across Texas. Eleanor accepted the coffee gratefully, her arthritic hands finding comfort in the warm ceramic. "Feels like a lifetime ago that we were sitting in that police station, learning the truth about Billy and Blackwood." The trial had been a media sensation that captured the attention of animal lovers across the country. Richard Blackwood received a life sentence for Billy's murder, plus additional decades for wildlife trafficking, conspiracy, and attempted murder. His entire criminal network had been dismantled, freeing hundreds of illegally captured animals and shutting down trafficking operations in 5 states. But for Eleanor, the real victory wasn't Blackwood's conviction. It was watching Shadow's kits tumble over each other in play, secure in the knowledge that they would never know captivity or separation. The smallest kit, a female with Shadow's distinctive markings, had claimed Eleanor as her special human. She would press herself against the enclosure fence whenever Eleanor approached, purring so loudly that visitors could hear it from across the sanctuary. "She reminds me of Shadow at that age," Dr. Sarah observed, watching the kit's antics. "Fearless and devoted to family." Eleanor smiled, remembering those first terrifying hours when Shadow had refused to leave Stormside on Highway 290. Billy would have loved seeing this. All these babies growing up wild and free, but still choosing to trust the humans who love them. The sanctuary had become Eleanor's second home, and in many ways her first real home since Billy's death. She'd moved into a small apartment just 5 minutes away, using part of her settlement money to ensure she could visit Shadow and Storm daily. The rest of Billy's life insurance money, along with the federal compensation, had been donated to establish the Billy Thompson Wildlife Protection Fund, which provided legal defense for other wildlife rehabilitators facing similar challenges. Dr. Sarah had initially protested Eleanor's generous donation. "You could live comfortably for the rest of your life with that money," she'd argued. But Eleanor had been firm. "Money can't bring Billy back, but it can protect other creatures like Shadow and Storm. That's what my son would have wanted." The sanctuary drew visitors from around the world, but Eleanor's favorite guests were the children from local schools who came to learn about wildlife conservation. She'd started giving talks about the importance of protecting wild animals and their families, always ending with the story of two Bobcat siblings whose love for each other had exposed a criminal network and brought justice for her son. "Mrs. Thompson," a little girl had asked during yesterday's school visit, "do you think Shadow knows she helped catch the bad man?" Eleanor had knelt to the child's level, looking through the fence at Shadow grooming one of her kits with infinite patience. "Honey, I think Shadow knows she did exactly what she was supposed to do. Love her family and trust the people who wanted to help them. Sometimes that's all it takes to change the world." This morning, as Eleanor watched the Bobcat family's peaceful routine, she felt Billy's presence more strongly than ever. Not the sharp pain of grief that had defined the past 10 years, but a warm sense of connection and purpose. Her son's death had meaning now, his sacrifice validated by every healthy animal that would grow up free because of the evidence he'd died protecting. "I have news," Dr. Sarah said, interrupting Eleanor's reverie. "The state legislature passed the Billy Thompson Wildlife Protection Act yesterday. It strengthens penalties for illegal wildlife trafficking and establishes mandatory reporting requirements for exotic animal dealers." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. Billy's name will be on a law that protects animals? For generations to come, Dr. Sarah confirmed. "Every wildlife rehabilitator in Texas will know your son's story and the sacrifice he made." Storm approached the fence near where they were standing, his yellow eyes bright with intelligence and contentment. He made a soft chuffing sound that Eleanor had learned was his way of greeting her, then settled into his favorite sunny spot to watch his sister with her offspring. "He's such a good uncle," Eleanor observed. "Never had kits of his own, but he loves those babies like they were his." "Some hearts are made for protecting others," Dr. Sarah said softly. "Storm understands that better than most humans." As if summoned by their conversation, Shadow padded over with the smallest kit dangling gently from her mouth. She deposited the adventurous baby near Storm, who immediately began grooming her with his rough tongue while Shadow returned to collect the other two. The family dynamic was so natural, so filled with love and cooperation, that Eleanor felt her heart swell with pride. "You know what the most beautiful part is?" Eleanor said, watching the Bobcat family settle into their afternoon rest. "They chose this. We gave them the option to go completely wild, to disappear into the hill country and never see humans again. But they chose to stay here, chose to trust us, chose to let us be part of their family." Dr. Sarah nodded, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I think about Emma every day when I watch them. She always said animals were just people in different bodies, that they felt everything we felt. Shadow and Storm proved she was right. The settlement money had also allowed Dr. Sarah to establish a memorial fund in Emma's name, providing free veterinary care for families who couldn't afford treatment for their pets. The little girl who dreamed of saving all the animals in the world was finally getting her wish, one rescued creature at a time. As the afternoon sun shifted position, casting longer shadows across the sanctuary, Eleanor pulled out her phone and scrolled to her favorite photo. It had been taken 3 months ago, showing Shadow and Storm lying peacefully together while the 3 kits slept between them. The image had gone viral on social media, shared by millions of people who found hope in the story of love triumphing over greed. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd driven past that morning," Eleanor mused. "If I'd been too scared or too tired to stop and help." "But you didn't drive past," Dr. Sarah said firmly. "You stopped because that's who you are. Someone who shows up when love needs defending, just like Billy." Eleanor smiled, thinking of all the people who'd reached out since the story became public. Letters from other seniors who'd found new purpose in wildlife conservation, donations from around the world to support the sanctuary, and countless messages from families who'd been inspired to help animals in their own communities. "You know what Billy always used to say?" Eleanor asked, watching Shadow nuzzle the smallest kit encouragingly as she practiced climbing a low branch. "He said every act of love creates ripples that spread farther than we can imagine. I used to think that was just pretty words. Now I know it's the truth." As evening approached and the Bobcat family prepared for their evening meal, Eleanor felt a deep sense of completion. She was 73 years old, living on her own for the first time in decades, and she'd never been happier. The empty house that had echoed with loneliness was replaced by this vibrant sanctuary filled with the sounds of wildlife and human purpose. "Ready to head home?" Dr. Sarah asked as they gathered their coffee cups. Eleanor took one last look at Shadow and Storm, now settled with the kits for their evening rest. The sight still took her breath away, a family intact, protected, and thriving because ordinary people had chosen to do extraordinary things. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and certain. "I'm ready." As they walked toward their cars, Eleanor felt Billy walking beside her, no longer a source of grief but a companion in the work of protecting innocent creatures who couldn't protect themselves. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new animals needing rescue, new opportunities to defend love against indifference. And Eleanor Thompson, 73 years old and finally understanding her purpose, couldn't wait to get started. Sometimes life asks us to choose between safety and courage, between comfort and conviction. Eleanor Thompson chose courage, and in doing so, discovered that our greatest losses can become our most powerful sources of strength. When we stand up for the innocent, whether they have 2 legs or 4, we honor the memory of everyone we've loved and lost. At 72, Eleanor found her true calling protecting 2 Bobcat siblings whose love reminded her that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about showing up when someone needs saving. What would you risk everything to protect? Have you ever found unexpected purpose in your golden years that gave your life new meaning? Share your story below. Your courage might inspire someone else to find their calling.